So welcome everybody to the second Café Scientifique for this season. This is brought to you by the Faculty of Science at the University of Victoria, which is in Victoria itself. Before we get started, I just wanted to take a moment to acknowledge where the University of Victoria is located and acknowledge and respect the Lekwungen-speaking people on whose traditional territory the university stands, the Songhees, Esquimalt, and Wasanich people whose historical relationships with the lands continue to this day. And it's a great place to work. It's where the science that you'll be hearing about, not only tonight, but in future talks, where all of that is conducted. And for tonight, it is a real great pleasure to introduce Dr. Caroline Cameron. She is a rock star on the Canadian health research landscape, and she's homegrown. So she is from Victoria. She did her undergraduate and graduate work at the University of Victoria before she went across the moat to the University of Washington in Seattle in the Faculty of Medicine. And then she was recruited back to the university as a Canadian research chair studying the bacterium that causes syphilis. And that's what we'll be hearing about today. And she has a real passion for studying diseases that lead to or cause social and health inequalities. And so I think that typifies, her advocacy for science and research, more broadly speaking. And outside of science, she likes to spend time with her family, hike, ski, and she has passion and advocacy for wildlife and biodiversity. And again, this is a real treat, and please join me in welcoming Dr. Cameron to the stage.
All right, thanks so much for that introduction, Jen. Really appreciate it. And hi, everybody. It's so nice to see a full crowd here. So as Jen mentioned, I am going to talk about syphilis. And when you hear that disease, that name, I just want you to check in on your feelings because I'm going to come back to that a little bit later. This disease has traditionally been associated with stigma and with shame, and I think that has led us to be in the situation that we're in today. Which I'll get to a little later. So in terms of this disease, I want to tell you a little bit about it, and we'll start off with that. So this disease is caused by a bacterium. It's caused by a bacterium called Treponema pallidum, and it's a corkscrew-shaped bacterium that is able to move in a corkscrew motion, and that allows it to be able to invade into every organ and tissue within a body in a very short amount of time after somebody gets infected. So when somebody gets infected, there's two ways that people can be infected. One is through sexual transmission, and the other is when it's passed vertically from an infected person to their developing fetus. So that's infectious syphilis and congenital syphilis. And so if we look at infectious syphilis, somebody gets infected and the bacterium goes through either the skin or your mucous membranes in your genital tract. And the bacteria moves throughout your body. What it also does is form this lesion. Sorry for those of you who are eating, but people in my household are used to this conversation. So it forms this lesion that is really unique. It's unique to this disease. And it's ulcerative and it's necrotic, so the tissue is dying. And that amazing lesion disappears. So that's called the primary stage of syphilis. It lasts for about a month and then it disappears in your skin or your mucous membrane, goes back completely to normal, which is amazing. And then the disease is moving through, the bacterium is moving through your body, and it's able to do things that a lot of pathogens can't do, including crossing into your brain, so crossing that blood-brain barrier, and moving into a developing fetus, so crossing the placental barrier. Not a lot of pathogens can do that. So it shows how invasive it is. So in the secondary stage of this disease, you get a rash, and you don't feel so great. So it's not really, it's hard to tell that it's syphilis at that point because it's kind of nondescript symptoms. And then that goes away again. And then you go into this latent stage, and you remain latent, sometimes for a lifetime. The disease never reemerges, but you're always infected. Your immune system can't get rid of that disease. In some people, it emerges as the classic symptoms that we know to be syphilis. So the cognitive disorder, and you can have stroke, you can have heart complications, you can have this tissue destruction where it's non-cancerous, but it looks like cancerous. So this wide diversity of symptoms arise during this disease. So that's congenital, that's infectious syphilis, and now we'll talk about congenital syphilis. So congenital syphilis, what happens here, it can either cause death of the fetus in utero. It can also cause stillbirth, and in fact, it's the leading cause of infectious stillbirth around the world. And then a baby can be born alive, and it can die right after birth. And then in some cases, a baby is born and lives, and within about 2 years from birth, the baby develops these symptoms of congenital syphilis. So congenital syphilis, the pathogen is able to affect the development of the baby. And so things like the bones are different. The pathogen goes into the bones and changes the bones. And the skull is very prominent. The teeth are very small and widely spaced. Babies can be blinded and deaf, and these cognitive disorders. So it really affects significantly and has devastating effects on a developing fetus. So most people, when I tell them what I work on, they say, "Why are you working on this disease? It's a disease of the past." But in fact, it's not. It's not a disease of the past. It's a disease of the past, the present, and hopefully not the future, and I'll talk about that a little later. So if we back up a little bit, we now know about the disease and the symptoms, and I'd like to talk a little bit about the history of this disease, which is really fascinating. It has changed the, I guess, the landscape of humankind. So the disease was thought to have come across with Columbus in the 1400s. And it was thought to have done that up until about this year. So earlier this year, there was a publication that came out that found evidence, again in the bones, of ancient skeletal remains from 14,000 years ago. So that's a pretty significant discovery. That was it was a disease that was related to syphilis, and the clinical strains that we now know that are circulating are thought to have entered humans about 3,000 years ago. So it's a much older disease than we ever thought about. And it's really considered the oldest human disease of an infectious origin. So if we think about how that has shaped history, and we think about some of the symptoms that I went through, in the 1400s, when medical reports and reports of this disease and the effect that it has had really started to be documented, there were battles that were waged, and we'd have soldiers on one side that were afflicted with this disease, and there's all these reports of the other team, the other side just running away from these wars because they were so worried about getting infected with this disease, where the disease, people's noses would fall off, their fingers would fall off. They had incredible disfigurement. So definitely it affected how the outcome of wars. We think about all the famous people that have been infected over the years. So just to name a few, Oscar Wilde, we have many artists that were infected, so Beethoven, we have Van Gogh, we have Gauguin, even Florence Nightingale, of all people, was thought to be infected. And this has never been proven, but Hitler also was suspected to have had syphilis. So you think about the cognitive impact of this disease on people and how that might have changed how people were thinking that were afflicted with this disease. So it really did shape history. And there's also some good things. There are many innovations that have come out of this disease. So the way that people used to treat people with this disease back in the 1400s was to take people, this is obviously before penicillin, before antibiotics, and they would take people and they'd put them in, believe it or not, boiling vats of water. And so the reason for that is the bacterium is very sensitive to heat. We now know this, but somehow somebody figured that out, and the people would often die from that treatment, as you can imagine. But at that point, it was 1 in 5 people that were infected with this disease. And it was such a stigmatized and devastating disease that they would choose that over having this disease. And another interesting tidbit is that in the 1920s, there was a Nobel Prize awarded for a researcher who, this is again before antibiotics, who figured out that if they infected people that were infected with syphilis with malaria, they could cure them of syphilis. So think about that. At that point, syphilis was a worse disease than malaria. Nobel Prize for that one. So the innovation that has come out of this is that another way that people were treated was with heavy metals and toxic compounds such as arsenic. So that actually was the first form of chemotherapy. And that has led to our current version of chemotherapy that has benefited probably some of you in the audience or people that you know and love. So another innovation that has come out of this disease is related to human ethics. And so over history, in the not too distant history, there have been some incredibly unethical studies that have been done related to this disease. And there are a few of them, unfortunately. One of the ones that is most well known is the Tuskegee study, which I'm sure some of you know about. It was where this was a government-sanctioned study, and it was where a county of African-American men in the southern U.S. were enrolled in a study, this was in the 1920s, to study this disease. And this study continued on through the 1970s. And during that time, of course, penicillin was discovered and shown to be effective at treating this disease. But these people were enrolled without consent in this study. They were not offered treatment, and that they were not told that there was treatment available when it became available. And it kept getting, the study kept getting authorized to continue. So it was finally discovered when it was leaked to the press, and then it was stopped. So there are other examples where there were studies done on vulnerable populations, on prisoners, on sex workers, on these vulnerable populations where they were intentionally infected with this disease to study it. So, and again, that was government-sanctioned study. So out of all of this, what emerged were these really rigorous rules in academic institutions and elsewhere to have review, ethical review boards review the science that is being done on humans. So that is a positive that has come out of these atrocities. So if we think about this disease, and we now know how it shaped human history, we know about the symptoms, we know about the disease itself, and if we kind of talk about the timeline. So we know that penicillin was discovered in the late 30s. It was shown to be effective against this disease, and that was a modern miracle. All of a sudden, we were going from 1 in 5 people being infected to actually it could be treated. So the number of cases went way down, and then we came to the 50s and the 60s, and especially the 60s, the number of cases started going up again. And then we came to the era of the 80s and the early 90s. And what happened there was HIV occurred. And so during that time, everybody was terrified of HIV. So condom use went up and STIs went way down, including syphilis. So during the 80s, it was thought to have been eliminated, this disease, because the caseload was so low. And so researchers started leaving the field. There was decreased funding available for study of this pathogen. And everything was going great until antiretroviral therapy came along. Antiretroviral therapy is a modern medical miracle. It allows people who are HIV infected to have low viral loads and not to infect other people. But what do you think happened with condom use? HIV is now a treatable disease, so condom use went way down. And so STI rates went way up, including syphilis. So we've had this, unfortunate combination of increasing rates, decreased funding, and decreased number of investigators. And then in terms of STIs, syphilis, those rates in particular have really increased more than other treatable STIs like chlamydia and gonorrhea. So why is that? So it's thought to be a multitude of reasons that have led us to the situation we're in right now, which is considered to be a global public health emergency. So it's the the quietest global public health emergency you have ever heard of. Nobody talks about this disease, yet it's increasing in numbers around the world. So it's not only that condom use has gone down, there's also the advent of the internet, of course, so that makes dating apps are very widely used now. That allows for anonymous sex to occur. So that has caused an increase in transmission. We have one antibiotic that can effectively treat this pathogen, and that's penicillin still. It's amazing. There's been no resistance to this pathogen, to penicillin, which is incredible. No other pathogen has this occurred for. But there's a global shortage of penicillin, and I don't think people know that either. I didn't know that until a few years ago. So there's one type of penicillin that is effective against this disease. It's called penicillin G. And there's only one company in the world that makes this, and it's in China, and it's incredibly toxic to make for the people who make it and for the environment. And so it's only made once or twice a year. And if there's an increase in the number of cases, then they can quickly run out of stocks, and that's the situation we're in now, is there's not enough penicillin to treat this infection, including within Canada and other high-income countries. So I come back to the comment I made at the beginning about checking in with your feelings about when you hear this disease. I really think that stigma also plays a large role in the situation we're in right now. People don't want to talk about this infection. It's just steeped in stigma because it's been with us for so long. And it caused these physical deformations that had that name of stigmata. So I think all of these things have led us to the situation we're at now, not effective treatment. The diagnosis for this disease is also quite poor, and I'll talk a little bit about that. So what we have now is this disease has always been prevalent in low and middle income countries. It has historically not been that prevalent since antibiotics were developed in high-income countries. But now it is prevalent. So the latest stats that we have are from 2022 because it takes a while to get accurate stats. And so in Canada, the number of cases in 2022, there were 3,700 cases of 14,000 of infectious syphilis in 2022 in Canada. There were 117 cases of congenital syphilis, and since 2022, the numbers have increased exponentially since then. We just don't have the final stats from there. And it's happening that way in other areas of the world. The US, as can be predicted, their number of cases is much more than ours, over 200,000 in 2022 for infectious syphilis and 3,700 for congenital syphilis. So we're in not a great situation, and we have to try to tackle this disease and try to get it to stop. So we talked about how there are few researchers that are studying this because of that period in the 80s when we thought we had gotten rid of this disease. So there's really only about 5 institutions around the world that study the pathogen itself. And the University of Victoria is the only one in Canada at this point, but we're trying to change that. We're starting to train people across Canada how to work with this pathogen. And so I just want to spend a few minutes talking about that because it's not a normal pathogen. It's very hard to work on, and it kind of takes a lifetime to learn how to work on it. So it's this corkscrew-shaped bacterium, as we talked about, and it seems like it would be pretty hardy because it's able to move throughout the body. But it does really well in a body. It doesn't do well outside of a body. So when we work on it in the lab, it doesn't live very long. It starts to die as soon as it's taken out of a host. We actually weren't able to culture it in vitro, so in a lab, until 5 years ago, which is amazing. So we had no source of bacteria to work with it. We didn't have those tools. It's also very fragile, and so you can't use regular methods to study it. So you have to kind of think outside the box and try different things. So not only are there few researchers, not much money, it's also really hard to work on. So the field has progressed very slowly if you compare it to other infectious diseases. So when we think about ways to try to tackle this disease, and that's what our lab does in the Department of Biochemistry and Microbiology at the University of Victoria. So what we have taken as an approach is to study how the bacterium causes infection. And we really try to use those discoveries to get an actual product out at the end. So we look at how the pathogen causes disease, how it infects, how it interacts with our body. And then we use that to try to develop a better diagnostic test. I promised you I'd talk about it, and I will. What diagnosis is about, and then about a vaccine. So currently, diagnosis of this disease is done with a test that was developed in the 1940s. There's been no innovation since then, or very little innovation. It's just kind of taking the same test format and doing it in a different way, which still doesn't work very well. So there's often false positives, there's false negatives, and you're detecting the immune response of the person who is infected rather than the bacterium itself. So because there's no immunity raised, infection is a lifetime, you will always test positive in those tests, even if you've been appropriately treated. So you can't tell if somebody is currently infected or if they had an infection in the past. And those diagnostic tests also can't detect congenital infection. So lots of problems with the current diagnostic tests. So part of our research program is to try to develop better diagnostic tests using that understanding of figuring out how the bacterium causes infection. And then we're also looking at vaccine development. And so for this, we are looking at the components of the pathogen that are important for infection. And that is what we will include within a vaccine. So there is no vaccine for this bacterium. There's not many vaccines for any bacteria. There's quite a few for viruses, not so many for bacteria. And so I don't want to say it's easy to make a vaccine against a virus, but I'm going to say it's easier to make a vaccine against a virus because there's only a handful of proteins in a virus. Whereas with a bacterium, we're talking about, for our bacterium, there's 1,000 proteins. So you have to figure out which of those proteins is important for infection and include that in your vaccine design. So not so easy. So one of the approaches we're taking is to take little bits of multiple proteins and just kind of stitch those all together to make one protein for a vaccine candidate. And then we can just produce one protein. It's cheaper, it's easier, and we can use that as a vaccine. But the other thing we're doing early on is what's called vaccine implementation, this distrust of modern medicine, and it's stemming from these horrible biomedical disease studies that were done with syphilis in the past. And now we're talking about creating a vaccine against this disease, and are we going to have people that want to take it? Because they don't trust this research anyways. So we've got a long journey ahead of us, both in terms of developing the vaccine, but also having vaccine acceptability with this vaccine. And then the other aspect that my absolutely wonderful research team and I are focusing on at the University of Victoria is training up more scientists, because we really need that to combat this disease. So I said there's hardly any institutions working on this pathogen around the world, and we're trying to increase that within Canada and elsewhere around the world. And so we're mentoring new early career investigators to really increase that, that technical knowledge. And it takes a while to transfer that knowledge about this disease, because it is so different than anything. I'm very happy to say that we have one person who's in the audience who is a new early career investigator who is also studying this disease at the University of Victoria now. So Helena Petrosova is in the audience. So we have more people that we are, and I actually think that we will have hope in the future for eliminating this disease. And I am so happy to take any questions that you have about this disease or anything else. Thank you.
Thanks very much. Questions here?
You said that penicillin G was only produced once or twice a year. I assume it probably requires refrigeration, but do you know what the half-life of it is?
So the question is, to reiterate that the type of penicillin that is effective against this disease is only produced a couple of times a year. And the question is, what is the half-life of it? So it is stored frozen, and it has a decent half-life, but the problem is that there's not enough made. And so they can't keep up with the demand for it. So even if it has a good half-life, it doesn't matter because it's all used up.
Here?
Just wondering, are there any other species that get syphilis besides humans?
Yeah, that's a great question. So the question is, are there any other species that get syphilis besides humans? And there are, and they are rabbits. They get a rabbit form of syphilis, which has a really fun name. It's called Treponema paralui caniculi. So it's similar to human syphilis, just a little different.
Yep.
Yes?
Does it have an animal origin that we know of? And a couple other questions about DNA sequencing. Has that been done for the possibility of getting at it that way with this sticky technology of mucking around with DNA?
Yeah, so I'll answer your last question first, which is, has the genome of the bacterium been sequenced, and can we get at solutions that way? So yes, it was one of the first genomes that was sequenced. It was in the late 1990s, and it was sequenced first because the genome is so small. So it has provided us a great resource, but it hasn't provided us the answers we thought it would. We thought it would give us these proteins that we need to go after for a vaccine. In fact, this pathogen is so distinct from other pathogens that 30% of those proteins are unique only to that pathogen. So we have no idea what they do, and those are probably the most important for causing infection. And what was your first question? Does it have an animal origin? So I do not know the answer to that. There, 14,000 years ago, we don't know.
One final question about, are there viruses that take on this bacterium?
So the question is, are there viruses that take on this bacterium? No. We do not know of that occurring. This bacterium, in terms of the size of it compared to a virus, it's much bigger. So I would envision that would not occur.
Here?
The point of your vaccine, is it to eliminate the syphilis from the body or just to stop it from developing further?
Yeah, so that's a great question. The question is the goal of our vaccination to eliminate the bacterium from the body or just to stop it? So our goal is the first that you said. So we really hope we can get a vaccine that is completely preventative, so no disease. But I will also say that that is a big challenge. And so we talk about this all the time with public health officials. How good does this vaccine need to be? And the answer is getting, as the emergency in terms of the number of cases is increasing, it's changing over the years. So at this point, if we can develop a vaccine that is able to prevent that lesion from forming, which is where the majority of the transmission occurs, that will be an accomplishment. And then we'd have to monitor closely individuals to see if they actually are infected and they're not developing that symptom, but they still could be having that damage occurring within their body. Great question.
We do not become immune ourselves, though, is that the case? So how does the vaccine work if we don't develop immunity?
Yep, another great question. So the question is, if we don't become immune ourselves, how do we develop immunity through vaccination? So the answer to that is that through vaccination, we have to do better than what happens during a natural infection. And so that's one of the great things about vaccinations, is you can figure out what's important and you can generate a better immune response against what's important to prevent infection. Whereas natural infection, you've got all of those. Your immune system has to tackle the whole pathogen. So that's the goal, is you identify what's important, you generate a better immune response against it, and that prevents infection.
You had a question here?
I have two questions. One is there excuse me, an age group that that we're seeing a significant increase in the cases with? And the second is, do you know what it is that makes it toxic to the people creating the penicillin?
Okay, so two questions. So the first is, what is the age group of people that are affected by this disease now? And it's all age groups now. It used to be more segmented, but it's anybody is susceptible to it now. So the second question was, what aspect of the production of penicillin G is toxic for people. So I think it's in order to have the penicillin be able to cross these barriers that normally pathogens and antibiotics can't cross, so moving across into the placental barrier and across the brain, they have to change the features of the antibiotic. And so it's adding that component that is toxic. I don't actually know a lot more about it, but I just know it's very toxic environmentally, that chemical modification that has to go on into the people.
Yep.
How often does an infection lead to like the third stage?
Yeah, so the question is, how often does an infection lead to tertiary syphilis? So this might be changing. The answer I'm going to give is based on data from before we were having such an increase in the number of cases. So the symptoms of the disease are changing now. They're going blind earlier. There's more detrimental effects earlier in the course of infection. So I think these statistics that I'm going to state probably are a bit different now than they used to be. But traditionally, it's been about 30% of infected individuals without treatment go on to develop tertiary syphilis.
Can I ask you, is it expensive, the treatment? Because that's what happens a lot of time with these diseases, is that becomes prohibitive to treat it. And if you're saying that it's not accessible that much, you're only doing it twice a year, how come Big Pharma hasn't come in and done a number?
So the question is it expensive to treat this disease? And that's kind of a two-part question. The first part is penicillin G is quite cheap. So it's not expensive to treat the disease. It is very expensive to treat the disease if someone isn't adequately diagnosed and treated, because there's this successive damage that's done to the host. So it's estimated about $1 billion a year in healthcare costs in the US alone for syphilis-related complications. And that's in the absence of appropriate treatment. So the second part of your question was, why hasn't Big Pharma just moved in and started to produce this version of penicillin that is really needed? And that's because every other pathogen is resistant to it. So there's not a lot of money in it for them. And that's the honest truth. They're not going to make a lot of money. So what's happening now is public health agencies, such as the World Health Organization, such as the CDC, such as the BC CDC, the Public Health Agency of Canada, it will move to a point where these pharmaceutical companies have to step in, because we're at that point with this public health emergency that we need solutions.
So you have to have the government behind you to force the issue.
Right, and there are mechanisms for doing that. So there's these mechanisms where pharmaceutical companies can be given a voucher for working on a disease where they might not make a lot of profit, but with this voucher, they can kind of skip a line with something else. So that instead of it taking 10 years to go through FDA approval, they can be reviewed in an earlier stage, still safely and everything. But it allows them to work on another disease that they're not going to make a lot of money off of, but at the same time they get a benefit of something else, like a cancer treatment or something that they're going to make a lot of money off of.
The numbers are accelerating. You've got to be in demand. So Big Pharma's going to have more accelerated sales. Does that
Theoretically, but if we can get enough penicillin or whatever that treatment is and have everybody coordinate where there's treatment, it'll get rid of the disease, eliminate the disease, and then there will be no more market for that. So, yeah. So we often talk about World Penicillin Day, where everybody takes penicillin at one point in a day, and then we should be able to eliminate this disease. We can't even talk about that anymore because we can't get enough penicillin.
Yep, here.
For congenital, those babies born with congenital syphilis, what is their quality of life and how long is it?
Yeah, great question. So the question is, for babies born with congenital syphilis that survive, what is their quality of life, and how long do they live? And that varies from individual to individual. It's generally not a great quality of life, and they generally don't live a full life. They have significant physical and mental disabilities.
Could I just ask, what are the symptoms? Like Joe Blow, like how would you know you're getting syphilis?
So the question is, what are the symptoms? How would somebody, a member of the general public, know that they have syphilis? So that is another reason why the caseload is increasing, because it's very hard to diagnose. So clinically, it's really hard to diagnose. And Sir William Osler, I don't know if you've ever heard of that person, but that's the parent of modern medicine, who is a Canadian. And they are responsible for basically pioneering modern medicine. And they have this famous quote that says, to know syphilis is to know medicine. And so what that means is that a clinician has to be incredibly knowledgeable in medicine to be able to accurately diagnose syphilis. So you can only diagnose it clinically from symptoms, and those disappear and they look like other things. It's called the great mimicker for this disease. And then the other way is through those diagnostic tests, which are very poor, false positives, false negatives. So how does somebody know they have syphilis? Generally, you don't. The ulcer is completely painless, so you can have it and not know it. So, you just have to go and get tested. If you have had a situation where you think you've had a sexual exposure, that could put you at risk. And some people are getting tested, every 3 months if they are sexually active, especially engaged in anonymous sex.
What's the test? Is it blood?
Yeah, so the most widely used test is a blood test, and it's a 2-part blood test. So that has its own limitations as well. So you have an initial test. If you test positive, you have to come back for a second test. So people are often lost to follow-up tests. And so, yes, it's a blood test, and it gives you an indication of whether your body has generated a response against the pathogen. It doesn't tell you pathogen.
Oh, sorry, yeah, back in the back.
Can you say anything more about what we think the history of the disease is? You said that 14,000 years ago there was some evidence. And where was that? And do we know anything more about what happened after that?
Yeah, so I told you the question is, what is the history of this disease? I mentioned that it was found in skeletal remains from 14,000 years ago, and then how was that evidence discovered? And so it was called polymerase chain reaction. So it's basically taking bone. And as I said, there's very few pathogens that can invade bone. And there's only 2 pathogens. So there's the pathogen that causes syphilis and the pathogen that causes leprosy that can invade bone. So this was taking ancient skeletal remains from Brazil and doing this amplification technique called polymerase chain reaction, where you can amplify or zero in on a specific sequence that's unique to a particular pathogen. So that was from 14,000 years ago. That was all they could get was that it was related to one of 3 diseases, all which are caused by the same species of the bacterium, but syphilis is caused by a separate subspecies. So I know we're getting into kind of the real technical stuff here, but the 3,000 years ago evidence is actually from the pathogen that causes syphilis. That was in the same region. So beyond that, we don't know much at this point.
Any other questions? Yep.
So if I'm understanding the question correctly, it's can we use the method that penicillin G uses to kill the pathogen to develop a new treatment? Is that the question? Okay, thanks for that clarification. So the question was, in the 1920s, as I mentioned, there was that researcher who used malaria to treat syphilis. And could we use that methodology, not malaria, but the same concept to treat syphilis now? So the reason that that worked is because malaria causes these waves of parasitemia. Malaria is caused by a parasite, and during those waves you have a large number of parasites, and so your body is creating this inflammatory response to get rid of that parasite. So there's a lot of heat that's generated, and so heat and the bacterium that causes syphilis, they don't go together. So that's why you get a rash in syphilis, is it likes the extremities because it likes a cooler temperature. In the lab, we can't grow it at a warm temperature. It can't be grown at 37, it's usually about 34. So we know that heat is not good, but we also know that the human body has to be within a certain temperature range before there's detrimental effects. So I don't know. I would think not, but nobody's tried it as far as I know recently.
Okay. Well, so that's like a second PhD thesis defense. You guys asked great questions. So thank you very much, Caroline. That was wonderful.
Thanks, everybody.